Yes. We're going to kick off, Alex, with your segment. I think this is really pertinent. It's about information control, and it's really interesting how this topic is creeping up to the surface in the wider press. So what have you got for us?
It is almost as if information control were being coordinated between the various blocks of countries in the West, Brian. We start off with Taylor Hudak's report for Children's Health Defence Europe. Our regular viewers will know Taylor and her peerless chairing of various symposiums, which she's done for outlets which have chosen to use UK Column as their platform. She lives in Europe now, she's from the States, and she's done a deep dive in this piece into the EU's latest proposal to censor the media. And she starts the headline with centralizing information control. That isn't over-egging the pudding. Now, this is a long read. I urge people to go to it and take a thorough understanding of what she's said. If you tap that again, you will see one of the kernels of this is that the European, ominously named Media Freedom Act, which was proposed by the European Commission, the boffins, the civil service of the EU, nearly a year ago now, is being portrayed as an effort to promote media independence and pluralism, but it establishes a board, a European board for media services. We don't have graphics for the further details, but this board will have a secretariat, and as we'll see as we go through the segments from other countries and parts of the world, the common thread is they'll be able to ask, how are you complying with censorship, particularly what's your code of conduct for things which are nasty and naughty, which we don't like. And most concerningly, if anyone were the equivalent of UK Column in the EU, if this goes through as envisaged, as Taylor reports it, it would mean that anyone that called them or was designated a media services provider, that would be UK Column or a mainstream outlet, would be obliged, before uploading to a very large platform, and of course that's how we get our content out there. We're banned from YouTube, but it also may apply to TikTok, Rumble, the likes of which we do use. We would first have to certify that we were editorially independent and that we had a certain self-censorship scheme in place. Otherwise, we wouldn't get to upload. That seems to be descending on EU media providers now in the name of media freedom. Let's go to the US. Reclaim the Net, which has the greatest volume of reporting on this whole issue of censorship, reports that the new CEO of X, formerly known as Twitter, who herself was an advertising senior with NBC before taking up this post, Linda Yaccarino, she has, if you tap that again, you get the details, an approach on what she calls lawful but awful content. It's not something that's Reclaim the Net made up. She was asked about the approach to moderation, that's the polite name for censorship, and she said, echoing others who've said this, particularly in the States, well, you have a First Amendment right to speak, freedom of speech, but you don't have freedom of reach. You can be drowned out. So if it's lawful but it's awful, it's extraordinarily difficult for you to see it. That's not her aspiring, that's her describing what Twitter is already doing right now. And as the piece notes, it's a very subjective boundary. We've got quite a lot going on in Australia, both federally and at provincial, at state level. Reclaim the Net is reporting from Canberra here that 6 Australian intelligence agencies have been told by the parliamentary committee that oversees them that they must tackle online misinformation, very much, again, along the lines of what are you doing to preempt the wrong thing coming out. Staying with Australia, we see on the next slide, I'd like to advance that the communications minister overseeing the agency in control here, ACMA, has been trying to justify this and saying, well, we don't have power to take things down. But of course, the chilling effect is there because the ACMA will have power to say, what are you doing to ensure that the wrong kind of things don't get online again? So a very unified theme. And in fact, the Australian government, the Department of, it's a very long name, but the communications for this case, has put up this consultation, new ACMA powers to combat misinformation and disinformation. They are seeking Australian residents' feedback on this exposure draft for comments of the amendment to the communications bill that's going through Parliament in Canberra. So from Australians, civil and well-reasoned responses would be very welcome. Again, they see the need to rebut this idea later down that page that they are censoring anything. Methinks they do protest too much. In Western Australia, one of the most tyrannical states even within Australia during COVID, Excess Deaths Australia on Substack has got a couple of interesting pieces. I've just put on screen the executive summary of the first of them. This is Western Australia's, the case against them. This isn't them boasting, the next slide will be, but this is them boasting that they had psychological warfare, full spectrum dominance, as outlined by this blogger. But if we go to the next slide, we see that they are actually boasting in some regards that they have copied Britain's Spy B. Because in the government of Western Australia's case, they are declaring their pandemic response a total success. I couldn't find the adjective total in the actual quote wording of what they've said, but Excess Deaths Australia has it. Let's look at the detail there, and we see that the Premier, Roger Cook, replacing one who seems to have gone off the rails and gone gaga during COVID, as we covered, said that his COVID response had been vindicated. Excess Deaths Australia says this report is nothing seen of obscene. It is inaccurate, amateurish propaganda, and historians will see it as the point at which the state collapsed. I think that's very trenchant. Coming back to Europe, and indeed a country just across the border from me, Germany, Deutsche Welle is reaching new lows in its attempt to smear Alternative für Deutschland as nothing but neo-Nazis. Here we see that the head of the German Domestic Security Agency, which calls itself the Office for Protecting the Constitution, is making a couple of low blows and saying that the moderates have left, only the hardliners are left. The Spitzenkandidat, the top candidate for AfD now, is a man called Maximilian Krah, and if you go to that piece by following the show notes, you will see later down the page that the press photographers for Deutsche Welle, which is Germany's equivalent of BBC World Service, publicly funded by a mandatory tax, have deliberately chosen an image of him closing his eyes and looking like Mr. Bean at the rostrum to make him look ridiculous. And a couple of weeks before, even more recent than that, is this piece from Deutsche Welle quoting Mr. Klein, the anti-Semitism Tsar in Berlin, saying that if AfD becomes popular with voters, as it now is, this will be a threat to Jews. And it's just all his feelings, as was the previous slide with the Bundesverfassungsschutz people saying this is, in our opinion, our estimation, this is dangerous. There's no substance to this. There's nothing, no description of what laws have been broken. So give those two a careful read. Well, it goes to the UN as well. The United Nations has a Supremo on the relevant area of rights, Mr. Victor, I'll just find his surname. It's not on the slide. Victor Madrigal Borlos. He is the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. Maybe a Freudian slip, because he seems to present himself as the independent expert for sexual identity in some of the comments. The Washington Stand has got the best covering write-up with a link to his remarks on what he has said last month. He's brought out a report which says that religious narratives, if they are used to justify discrimination, of course he prefaces it with violence to make it less contradictable, but discrimination could just be, I don't think that what you're doing is God's will. He says that if you say that in a religion, you're often in defiance of the doctrine of those faiths. And he teases that out later in his report to say that actually LGBTQIAP plus people have a requirement for access to spirituality. And therefore, if you have a religious objection to some of their practices, you are wrong, including in your religious terms. Nearly every line in the report is troubling, says the Washington Stand, worth a careful consideration too. The United Nations also has had the latest round of the fruitless ding-dong that often goes on when Islamic countries are pitted against Western countries in the matter of freedom of speech on matters of religion. This is coming out of the United Nations Human Rights Council, not the only human rights body at the UN. There's a council and a committee. It gets very complicated because of the checkered history of UN on freedom of speech. But the point here, as blogged by Persuasion, Jacob Janagama, as a guest author, I think, for that blog today, is that this resolution, we could shallowly look at it and think that it's the Muslims saying you mustn't have freedom of speech to criticize Islam. But as it is pertinently observed in the piece, the regimes in question come down on their own Muslim subjects very hard as well. And they seem to be ganging up or joining this bandwagon of curtailing freedom of speech for just the fortuitous purposes of doing that. In Britain, more specifically England and Wales, home education is always a hot potato these days. The HE Byte as another long read, which people should definitely go to, which covers vocal peers, so some activists in the upper chamber, the House of Lords, saying how terribly disappointed they are that what they like now to call illegal schools are not being cracked down on. These are simply Islamic schools and Jewish schools. We've covered this issue before. It's no longer just a matter of Christians concern. It's Muslims and Jews as well, and some other philosophical streams, humanists of certain kinds as well. It's clear that the government is wanting schools that are not under its purview to be outlawed somehow, but it's only activists in the upper house at the moment who are making that point. Over to the Levant, where Vanessa will be speaking to us from shortly. Jordan, which has become a very authoritarian state recently, as reported by The Cradle, one of the best Middle Eastern reporting sources, has a new leap towards totalitarianism. It doesn't say it in this piece, but it looks like the British government has been at work here, because Jordan now has a law on cybercrime. I would say that's old wares in a new presentation. Cybercrime, which is just a variation of hate speech. And you find details there of how Jordanians already have high-end surveillance tools that deployed against them, which discriminate against them when they apply for jobs, for example. But it's not just in faraway countries. In my old stomping ground in the Cotswolds around Stroud, the local MP, Siobhan Bailey, has written this piece on the Light paper. She says that it seems to sow division and create fear. Note that she's not claiming that it does. She doesn't say conspiracy theories either. She uses couching language, seems to, other people would say. Let's see the detail. She says, having made a point in earlier paragraphs that she doesn't want to associate herself with the argument, ban the Light paper, she does say there's a balance to be struck here. Don't give them the oxygen of publicity. It needs to remain in the shadows, and most particularly of all, the Light is not a legitimate publication, unlike the Stroud News and Journal. But if you tap that again, you will see that she has already belied that at the top of the piece. She says that it's in response to previous requests, her staff contacted the local district council to see whether they could stop distribution of the Light. So it seems rather insincere what she's claiming here. And just in closing this segment, we have a comment from a mainstream journalist who has published on our front page now in the comment section halfway down the main page. He's asking whether the worm is actually turning and suggesting that actually Siobhan Bailey MP and others of her ilk might not always be able to rely on the mainstream media to present these one-sided arguments for them, because a lot of them are now watching the likes of UK Column.
Alex, thank you very much for that excellent report. It is incredible, isn't it? Many of our viewers are saying, well, of course, this shows that the establishment, if we call it that, is desperate to suppress anybody who's got a dissenting viewpoint, and that seems to be the case. So nobody can start a newspaper unless they conform to the government narrative, UK in 2023. Well, let's follow